So our final snippet for today is going to look at the early stages of the Carter presidency. And Carter was someone who entered with a lot of promise and wound up dramatically weakening his overall approach. Um, this is a photograph that we have on the screen of the president and the first lady walking in the inauguration parade. And Carter's goal was to present himself as a man of the people, and to sort of implement this kind of common person touch. The problem with that is that the president is in the end not a man of the people. It's very difficult to sustain this kind of populist approach throughout his presidency. Similarly, Carter had promised an ethically pristine administration. There is, of course, no such thing. And so he was unusually vulnerable to any allegations of impropriety among his key leaders. And his budget director, this man named Burt Lance, there was an allegation that he had ethics issues. He's forced to resign, and this tarnishes Carter's opinion among sort of lots of Democrats and indeed among the country as a whole. One of the other things about Lance, Carter, has no background in Washington. He brings in a lot of people with him from Georgia, people that he knew, people that he was comfortable with, but he has a contentious relationship with both houses of Congress because he really has relatively few people who represent the mainstream Democratic Party. And his economic agenda is an interesting one, but is not one that would associate with Truman or with JFK or with LBJ or even with Clinton and Obama thereafter. He's more of a moderate or conservative Democrat. He's interested in issues away from the welfare state. His first major domestic initiative is a program to develop energy sufficiency, which turns out to be a good idea in theory, but very difficult to implement in practice. And Congress never even votes on Carter's bill. His major economic accomplishment is this ambitious deregulatory agenda, the idea of getting the federal government out of minute economic decisions. And maybe the highest profile of the example of this came in this decision to deregulate the airline industry. Before the mid 70s, airline industry is very heavily regulated. The federal government, the FAA, would dictate, what routes could be drawn, what amount airlines could charge. This deregulation creates a new wave of cost-cutting airlines. The most famous from the period is this airline, the People Express, which is based out of Newark. And which is designed to have cheaper weights, cheaper tickets, and more of a no frills approach to the flight. Almost all of these airlines fail during this period. The one airline from this period that's cost-cutting airline that flourishes is Southwest, which had been mostly a Texas airline before the era of deregulation and dramatically expands in the 80s and into the 90s. But the idea of deregulation, which is a traditionally conservative idea, is one that Carter embraces, and is probably his most significant positive economic legacy. I think most people consider the airline industry a kind of better place by the 90s or 2000s, where tickets are more affordable, more different kinds of people can fly. Carter ultimately is undone by international matters and the effect that international matters have on the domestic scene. In 1977 and especially in 78, there's unrest in Iran, which at the time was the US's closest ally in the Middle East outside of Israel, led by the Shah, who had been propped up by the United States since 1953. The Shah was ill. He would die of cancer in 1980. He was notoriously indecisive anyway. Carter similarly was indecisive. He was torn between his foreign policy of promoting human rights, which would suggest a tough line against the Shah, and his concern that a government that would follow the Shah would be anti-American. And as a result, there were inconsistent signals. And in the end, in late 1978, the revolution crests, the Shah flees the country, and in early 1979, a transitional regime is installed that will lead to the coming of power of the Ayatollah Khomeini and creating this Islamic state which still rules Iran. The unrest in Iran, which was a major oil producer, sold a lot of oil to the United States, triggers a second wave of inflation. Inflation begins to increase in 1978 up to 9%, then up to 13% in 1979 and 12% in 1980. There had not been consecutive years of double-digit inflation since the period before the Depression. There's a real concern here that the economy is careening out of control. Interest rates similarly skyrocket during this period. Interest rates now are like 3-4% if you're getting a 30-year mortgage. In the late 70s, it's over 20%. And so for lots of middle-class Americans, much less working-class Americans, the idea of purchasing a home is simply inconceivable during this time. And Carter's response is technocratic. The argument is we'll kind of wait it out. We'll trust the Federal Reserve to manage the economy correctly, and it doesn't really work out that way. Carter's director of the Fed is this guy, Paul Volcker. And Volcker's argument is that the political branches should largely stay out. The Federal Reserve Board will raise interest rates, and eventually that will lead to a cooling of the economy, basically an induced recession. But if there is a recession, people are spending less, and that will reduce inflationary pressures, which is more or less what happens, oversimplified, in 1981 and 82. But by then, of course, Carter is no longer the president. This is a chart that shows the prime rate. So that's the rate that's available to the sort of most high-profile banks. The actual mortgage rate is going to be much higher than the prime rate is, and we haven't seen any rates, borrowing rates like this before or since in post-war U.S. So the economy is kind of shutting down, an experience that sadly we're not unfamiliar with now in 78 and 79. And Carter seems to be ill-prepared to deal with it. The end result of this is this infamous presidential speech, which has come to be known as the malaise speech, even though Carter doesn't use the word malaise in the address, but in which he seems to be panicking and almost blaming the American people for what's this didn't seem to come across. It did come across as weak, as flailing, and if the president isn't providing leadership, then who is? Carter invites his cabinet to a weekend meeting at Camp David, the presidential retreat. He asks for their resignations, and in this great surprise, he accepts several of them. This kind of cabinet reshuffle is pretty common in European democracies. It is very, very rare in the United States. We haven't seen it anywhere else in this term. And there's this image of a leaderlessness in the Carter administration by 1979, which, as we run into late 79 and 80, is going to come into international events again and cause some real problems. So that's the end of this snippet, and the next batch of snippets we'll see next week. So hope everyone is staying safe, and I'll talk to you again soon.